taking place in the Middle East, specifically Iraq in particular. So on Friday, the U.S. government is claiming that militia fighters that are connected with Iran attacked a U.S. military base in Iraq, which killed one U.S. contractor and I believe wounded four other soldiers. So, as retaliation, on Sunday, the U.S. military conducted airstrikes at, I believe, two or three locations in Iraq and then two locations in Syria, targeting those Shiite militia fighters that are, connected or have ties with Iran. So those airstrikes that the U.S. military conducted on Sunday ended up killing around 25 people and wounding several dozen more. So there was quite a big pushback and outrage over these airstrikes. So the Iraqi prime minister came out and condemned the airstrikes as a violation of the sovereignty of Iraq, which obviously it clearly was. These attacks weren't coordinated at all with the Iraqi government. They didn't get any say or input into these attacks. And then so fast forward now to Tuesday, there was, some pretty massive protests and unrest happening outside of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. You can, look at some of the images online. There were several thousand people basically surrounding the parts of the embassy that they could. There were some people, I think, that kind of got into the embassy. It's just a huge kind of massive protest. These protests were obviously in regards to those, illegal airstrikes that happened that killed, a couple dozen people as well as wounding several dozen more. And the protests that were happening at the U.S. Embassy on Tuesday, I saw some signs, people just calling for the end of the U.S. occupation of the country, just wanting them, the U.S. basically the people in Iraq, if they weren't already, they're completely done and fed up with the U.S. government. They don't want any more U.S. troops in their country because if there are, things like this will just continue, to happen. And, nobody was killed at these protests at the U.S. embassy that took place today. But of course, Trump went on Twitter and in his belligerent, bellicose way started making threats towards Iran. So this is a quote from Trump, quote, Iran will be held fully responsible, quote, not a warning, it is a threat. So, I don't know, Trump, I will give him some credit. He hasn't, up until this point, listen to the more hawkish members of his administration, people like, well, John Bolton's gone, but people like, Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence, people of that ilk. He hasn't, instigated a war with Iran yet, but it seems like we could be heading closer and closer towards that path. So the White House said that, after Trump saw what was happening or taking place outside of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, that he contacted the Iraqi prime minister asking if he could get some support from the Iraqis in protecting, the U.S. presence in the embassy. And then, so Pompeo, the Secretary of State, it was very interesting what he said about this happening. This is a quote from him, quote, in reference to the U.S. being in Iraq, they're to support a sovereign and independent Iraq. So obviously that is a direct contradiction to what the Iraqi prime minister called out the U.S. for doing with regards to these airstrikes, that being violating the sovereignty of that country, coming in, dropping these bombs on people in Iraq without giving any type of prior consent or warning to the Iraqi government. So obviously, Mike Pompeo is trying to put a spin as much as possible on the U.S. continued occupation of of Iraq. We've been there almost 17 years with no real end in sight. We still have over 5,000 troops there and several thousand contractors too, I believe. And Trump talked about bringing all of the troops home and ending these endless wars, and he hasn't really lived up to that promise that he made, you know, back during the 2016 campaign in any real tangible way. And also, it really needs to be pointed out, these Shiite militia fighters who are tied and connected with Iran. These are the same militia people that had been and have been fighting ISIS in a for a number of years in Iraq, within Syria, and these other places that ISIS has cropped up. But in particular in Iraq, these are these same militias that have been fighting relentlessly against ISIS. And again, ISIS was created out of the power vacuum that the US made by taking Saddam Hussein out of power. So not only did the US create ISIS, they are now bombing the same militia fighters that have been fighting ISIS in the very beginning. So it's like, I mean, the US has no like coherent foreign policy or foreign policy strategy or guiding principle, and honestly it just seems to be endless occupation and war in order to further increase the profits of military industrial complex corporations like Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and GE and General Dynamics, and the list goes on. Because I mean, I would be very surprised if more than, let's say, 10% of the U.S. population still wants the U.S. to have any type of, presence whatsoever in Iraq. And now here, 17 years later, or thereabouts after the war was started, we still have over, again, 5,000 troops there, 2,000 or several thousand contractors, I should say, with no real plan or end in sight of when those people are going to come home, when we're going to stop wasting money dropping bombs, killing people, destroying people's lives, not only of the Iraqi civilians and citizens, the hundreds of thousands who have been killed by this war, by this needless occupation, but also the thousands of American troops that have been killed, and then, obviously those families who have been impacted by that will feel the effects of that loss for time, immemorial, not to mention the trillions of dollars that will have been wasted when we finally do get out of there, when we have, a crumbling infrastructure, our educational system is falling apart. We need Medicare for all, we need free college, we need a Green New Deal, all of these other things, or diplomatic money. We could be using this to generate positive relations with countries like Iraq through things like helping them develop a green infrastructure or technology or whatever it may be. Instead, again, we've wasted trillions of dollars in this endless occupation, in this endless war that has only benefited the military industrial complex and the wealthy oligarchic elite, who on both sides of the aisle always want more war and death and destruction, because it helps to keep them get reelected, because they are supported by those same forces that make the bombs and things like that. And also, it should be pointed out that Trump was the one to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. One of the few bright spots, in my opinion, under Obama's administration was getting that Iran nuclear deal passed. Trump gets in office, he sees it as something positive that the Obama administration was able to accomplish. So just for that reason alone, I think is why he took the U.S. out of it, even though it definitely needs to be pointed out Iran was following that deal to a T. I believe it was the IEA, the International Association of Atomic Energy, or something like that. They had done numerous kind of, how should I say, numerous um, observations where they would go into Iran, or inspections. I don't know why it took me so long to think of the word inspections, but the IEA did multiple inspections of these, these nuclear facilities that Iran was using to generate nuclear energy. They saw concretely that they weren't, using this material to try to make some type of nuclear weapon. And now, so after they were in agreement with that for so long, Trump pulls them out of it. And then now Trump says he's willing to negotiate another nuclear deal with Iran. But Iran, seeing how the U.S. totally stabbed them in the back the last time they had this deal happening, they say they're not going to start any type of negotiation until the U.S. lifts these very punitive and very harmful sanctions that have been placed on Iran. So until those sanctions are lifted, then Iran's not going to negotiate, which definitely makes sense. So I mean, it definitely didn't have to go this way, and a big part of that problem was Trump pulling the U.S. out of that Iran nuclear deal because, in a sense, it gives Iran some, I don't know, it's almost some like leverage in a way. It's like, well, you're gonna like f me over in this way, the United States, then why should I come crawling back to the bargaining table with you when I was in full compliance with this agreement before that was signed during the Obama administration? Now you want to sign another agreement with me while you're still placing these horrible economic sanctions on my country that are leading to, like lack of medicine, lack of these other vital things, and people dying as a result of it. So no, I'm not going to negotiate with you while those are in still place. Are you nuts? So, I mean, that's kind of the position that they're coming from. And I don't know, it's going to be very interesting and crucial to see what happens going forward. I mean, I don't think, Trump in his hearts of hearts wants to start a war with Iran, but he does have a lot of hawkish people around him, like Pompeo, like Senator Graham, and these other neocons that never met a war that they couldn't, justify or get behind for whatever, ridiculous reason they were using at the time. But from my perspective, the U.S. needs to get out of Iraq. They should have never been there in the first place. Get those troops home, get those contractors out of there, and let's figure out if the Iraqi government and the people there are wanting and open to it, some, diplomatic aid, some humanitarian aid of how we can help out and partner with the country. They don't need any more of our bombs or tanks or aircraft carriers or, soldiers assassinating civilians. They don't need any more of that. They've had enough of that to last them for their lifetimes. Just think about from the perspective of a Iraqi citizen. So if we were in the U.S. and let's just say Russia was, occupying our country, and then they bombed, some of these militia groups that were fighting, the U.S. equivalent of ISIS. And so Russia bombs, kills these militia fighters that were fighting the U.S. equivalent of ISIS. We'd probably get rightfully pissed as well and want to go protest at the Russian embassy in Nebraska or wherever it was. So it's like, I mean, we got to take a little bit of a step back from this U.S.-centric worldview and think about how our foreign policy causes so much harm, around the world. But I could go on and on about this. I just really hope the U.S. doesn't get into another war in the Middle East, because I think if they did, it would be at least as damaging and costly, both in terms of lives and in terms of money as the Iraq War was, but I think it could end up being, a lot worse because I believe the Iranian military is quite a bit stronger and more capable than the Iraqi military, as well as the support they would get from these militia groups that are in Iraq and Syria. Then they would join that fight in Iran, or that would attack U.S. forces wherever they would be. So it would be another huge mistake, a huge blunder for the U.S. to start a war with Iran. Those are just my thoughts. I would love to hear yours in the comment sections down below. Peace.